By the second autumn after David Walker rode in, the townspeople had stopped calling the Jackson farm cursed. Mabel didn't know that yet. She only knew the apple trees yielded less fruit with every passing season, and that the men who had come to inspect her irrigation had each left without saying much, Nelson and Briggs among them. She had started to believe them, and that was the part she couldn't forgive herself for. She had known exactly where the trouble lay for 2 years. She walked the North Line every spring, following the path Robert had taught her and the improvement she had made to his methods, and she had found it. The section below the second drainage post where the soil stayed saturated too long after rain, where the grade flattened and the water backed up instead of moving. The North Line was designed for a dual purpose: to carry water in during the dry weeks and to drain it off after a heavy downpour. When it failed, the Westfield drowned first and dried poorly afterward. Mabel had taken a spade to it twice, digging deep enough to confirm that something had given way in the line, but she could not dig it out alone. She couldn't hold the trench, manage the upstream pressure, and relay the pipe by herself. The money that would have paid someone qualified was the very money the failing farm was no longer generating. So both times she had covered it back over, gone inside, and started supper. The men had come. They had stood where she told them to stand, looked where she told them to look, and muttered about dry seasons and hard luck before going home. Eventually, she stopped asking. What she had not done, however, was stop knowing. David Walker arrived in town on a Thursday in late April, just as the cottonwoods along the creek road were coming into leaf. He stopped because his horse needed water and he needed a meal, and the saloon was the only building with a light still burning past 8. He took a stool at the far end of the bar and ate in silence. He was nearly through his plate when he became aware of a conversation at the round table near the back wall. 3 men sat with their chairs pulled close, their voices hushed for privacy, which in the quiet room meant he could hear them clearly. They were talking about a farm, a widow's place north of town. They spoke of the failing water line and the orchard yield dropping every season. One of them mentioned exactly what that acreage would go for per acre. It was a specific practice number, the kind a man produces without needing to look it up. Nobody reacted as if it were a strange thing to know. The other 2 nodded with the ease of men discussing a decision already finalized. David had come west fixing other men's water, and he knew the difference between bad luck and a trap. He finished his plate and turned his coffee cup once in his hands before setting it down. He ordered a second cup and stayed at the bar much longer than he had planned. The next morning, before doing anything else, he rode past the Jackson farm. What he saw was not a failing farm. It was some of the best positioned soil in the valley being slowly strangled by a collapsed line. The apple trees were rooted in clay that would hold water better than most if the line were running right. The Westfield had a natural grade that, if properly channeled, would nearly work by itself. He knew what land looked like when it had been left to fail on purpose. This land looked exactly like that. He sat on his horse at the fence for a while, reading the ground. Then he rode back toward town to figure out how to approach the widow Jackson without sounding like every other man who had come to tell her what was wrong. She was in the yard when he came up the track, a woman in a dark work dress, hair pinned back, a bucket of feed grain on her hip. She stopped and waited with the stillness of someone who has learned that most arrivals cost something. A boy appeared at the porch rail, perhaps 12 years old, with his mother's coloring and the serious face of a child who had been the man of the house longer than suited him. David dismounted at the gate and took off his hat. He told her his name and explained that he had ridden past her land that morning and thought he knew what was wrong with her water line. Mabel set the grain bucket down and folded her arms. "The men I've hired thought they knew too," she said. "Below the second drainage post on the north line," he replied, keeping his voice even. "The grade flattens there. The line's collapsed. It can't carry water in or off anymore, and your Westfield is paying for it both ways." Mabel Jackson looked at him, not with the look of a woman weighing whether to trust a stranger, but with the look of someone who has finally been told something true after a long time of being told things that weren't. "That's where I thought it was," she said. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you asking?" He told her he would fix what he'd found. He would sleep in the barn and ask for nothing else. When the work was done, he would move on. She studied him for a long time. The boy had come down off the porch steps and was standing beside her now. "All right," she said. She picked up the grain bucket and returned to the chickens. The boy stayed at the gate. "I'm Will," he said, offering his hand like a man. "David," he replied, shaking it. "You know your way around a trench?" "Some." "You'll know more by the time we're done." Will held the gate open and David led his horse through. They started on the north line during the first week of May, while the ground still carried the chill of a late spring. Mabel came out at first light with 2 cups from the stove. She set one on the fence post near him without a word, then went to open the orchard gate. David worked without urgency and without wasted motion. When he opened the trench below the second post, the collapse revealed itself exactly where she had said it would be. He crouched over it with both hands in the soil and looked up at her. "How long have you known?" 2 years. He nodded and went back to the trench. She told him where to open the orchard ground, and he followed her direction without question. He had the tools and the understanding of water, pressure, and grade. She had grown up watching this particular soil. She knew how it drained after a hard rain, where the frost hit hardest, and what the clay did in a dry spell. He seemed to understand the value of that knowledge without being told. He listened, and he dug. By the second week, Will was beside him every morning, asking questions that David answered in full. The actual answers, not versions stripped of their complications. Will already knew things because Mabel had taught him, and the accuracy of his knowledge settled somewhere in David without comment, the way a level settles when the bubble finds center. By late May, the north line was relayed and running clean. By June, the Westfield was moving water exactly as the grade had always intended. When the first real summer rain came and the field held it properly. For the first time in 3 years, Mabel stood at the edge of it in the gray morning, her boots in the wet grass. Then she went back to the house and made breakfast. In June, the gossip started. Julia was leaning across the fabric bolts at Heller's when Mabel walked in, her voice carefully arranged to sound like concern. "People are starting to talk, Mabel. A man sleeping in your barn all spring." Mabel set her bolt of cotton on the counter. She looked past Julia to Heller behind the register, who was polishing a jar that was already clean. Heller had kept accounts in this town long enough to know when men were calling a thing cursed because they wanted it cheap. Mabel had always suspected he knew more than he said. "Robert hired men every spring before he got sick," she said, keeping her eyes on Heller. "Nobody talked then." Julia straightened. "That was different." "It was," Mabel agreed. She picked up the cotton and moved toward the register. "He had a wife." She paid and left. By the following week, she could feel the tension in town, glances that lasted a half second too long, conversations that quieted in a particular way. She felt it, noted it, and went on with what needed doing. The orchard came in heavy in September. Branch after branch hung low with fruit, the smell sharp and cold in the early morning air. Will climbed the loading ladder and passed crates down in silence. Once, when Mabel looked up, she saw him grinning at the tree above him, the way he used to grin before Robert died. She looked away before he could see her looking. David worked the harvest alongside them without commenting on the yield. Mabel had put the good cloth out the night before the first picking, the one from the cedar chest, the one she'd used to wrap the bread she'd sent to the barn that first morning. After the harvest supper, she found it on the porch rail, washed and folded into a neat square. She stood looking at it for a moment, then went inside. The Westfield stood tall the following spring, a full stand of grain where there had been 3 years of failure. It was that, even more than the orchard, that made the town start asking questions. The truth that emerged was not complicated. Each time Nelson or Briggs had come to look at the Jackson farm, they had understood exactly what the water line needed. They had said nothing because the land they called cursed was the land they were waiting to seize at a reduced price. One of them had even spoken to a land broker in the county seat the week after his second visit. It was Heller who finally told her on a Tuesday in March. Standing in her doorway with his hat in both hands, he had the look of a man who had carried a secret too long. Mabel listened to all of it. When he finished, she simply said, "Thank you, Howard." After he left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The stove ticked. The chickens moved in the yard. Outside, she could hear Will's voice followed by David's discussing the east fence grade, the boy asking, the man answering. The anger in her chest was clean and cold. It wasn't the anger of surprise, it was the anger of confirmation, which carries a different weight entirely. She had not been fooled, she had been outmaneuvered. She had waited 3 years for the difference to matter. An hour later, she found David at the workbench in the barn, fitting a valve to the east branch of the line. She stood in the doorway until he looked up, then told him what Heller had said. David set the valve down. The quiet that followed was different from his usual silence. There was something behind it he wasn't going to perform. Then he picked the valve back up and turned it in his hands. "I heard them in the saloon that first night," he said, "talking about the acreage price." She looked at him. "Then you already knew what they were." "I knew what kind of men they were," he replied, setting the valve on the bench. "I didn't know the rest of it until just now." She went back to the house and started supper. He came in when the light outside had turned a deep blue, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the table without being asked. She placed a plate in front of him. Will sat between them and talked about the east fence, and the two of them answered him in turns. The harvest was in by the 3rd week of October. The trees were stripped and resting, the air carried the scent of fallen apples, and a real cold had begun to settle underneath it. They walked the north road together after supper, as they sometimes did, ostensibly checking the root zone. David stopped walking before she did. She took another step, realized it, and turned back. He was looking at the orchard the way he looked at work he had finished and found good, not with pride, but with something quieter. It was the settling of a man who had done what he came to do and was in no hurry to leave. He looked at her. "I want to stay on," he said, keeping his voice level. "Not as a hired man, permanently. This land is as good as any I've worked, and Will's got another few years before he can run it the way it needs running." By then, I'd like to know it the way you know it. He paused. I'd like to know it with you. He reached into his coat pocket and held out his hand. In his palm was a plain iron ring, worn smooth. Not new, but the kind of thing a man carries a long time before he knows what it's for. Will you marry me? Mabel looked at the ring. Then she looked at him, at the steadiness of him that had been present in the trench, at the workbench, and at her kitchen table. It was the kind of steadiness that does not perform itself because it has never needed to. Her throat moved. The boy already thinks you're staying, she said. He stopped asking weeks ago. The corner of David's mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. Yes, she said. He closed her hand around it with both of his and held it there for a moment. Not long, just long enough. Then he let go. They stood in the orchard a little longer and then walked back toward the house through the long October light. They married in June. Heller gave a brief toast. Will stood beside David at the front of the room, his hair combed and his boots polished. The expression on his face was the same one he'd been wearing since October, when he'd come in from the orchard and found them already back at the house, not looking at each other too carefully. By the following season, the Jackson farm was producing more per acre than most spreads in the valley. Buyers came from 2 counties over for the orchard fruit, and the grain sold at top price 3 years running. Nelson and Briggs still drove past on their way to market, but they did not stop. On a Tuesday morning in late September, Mabel came out to find Will on the porch steps, prying a stone from his boot sole. The yard was loud with birds moving through the orchard. She handed him the cloth-wrapped bread for Heller's order, the good cloth, the one from the cedar chest. She didn't save it for special occasions anymore. He took it, looked at it, and then looked at her. He left the second boot alone, stood up, and headed down the steps. He was already on the road when she turned back to the door. From behind the house came the sound of David at the pump, the long rhythmic clank of it, and the sound of water coming up cold from the ground. She went inside and started the morning. That was the story of Mabel and her son, Will, and of the man who rode past their land on a Thursday morning and saw what everyone else had chosen not to see. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you for watching Dustin Hart Western Tales.